Welcome back, everybody. This is part 3 of the nervous system, chapter 14. So we're going to revisit the spinal cord, and then we're going to dive into the parts of the brain, excuse me, the brainstem, as well as talk about some neurotransmitters and addiction. All right, so the spinal cord, is the major nerve, if you will, that's running from the brain down the spine, and it's protected by the vertebral column or the vertebral column. So we know that any serious injury to our spinal column, of course, could seriously impact our ability to survive. So super important for that spinal cord to be protected by those bones of the vertebrae. So in addition to acting as, the primary gateway for the communication, so sending information from the sensory nervous system or the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system to the spinal cord to the brain to the spinal cord and back out, we know that it's also a gateway for pain signals, and motor signals from the brain pass back down the spinal cord out to the muscles. So, for example, if you step on something sharp, you have pain receptors and many other types of receptors in your skin. So on the bottom of your foot, you are essentially sensing this object that is pushing into your foot. The receptors are going to take that information and send it into essentially the sensory division of your peripheral nervous system. So those are sensory neurons. And the sensory neurons are going to send that information to the interneuron of the spinal cord that takes that up to the brain, again, of interneurons. And because you need to move your foot, there are muscles in your foot that are responsible for the movement of your foot. Now we have to send that information back down the spinal cord and out the motor division of the peripheral nervous system to affect the muscles. So this would be the effector. So now the muscles are contracting and your foot is moving so that you're not continuing to press on a harmful object. Serious damage to the spinal cord, and the example of paraplegia, quadriplegia can then leave you paralyzed. Paraplegia means essentially you have damage in the thoracic region of the spine, so just the lower legs and lower body are paralyzed. And quadriplegic essentially means that you have damage in the neck region, so all 4 limbs are affected. We haven't talked about reflexes, so we have a number of very quick acting responses of our nervous system that are going to protect us and be even quicker than the regular flow of information as I described in the previous slide. So a reflex essentially involves a stimulus affecting some sensory receptors, and that generates a signal that goes directly to the spinal cord. But at the place in the spinal cord, there will be an interneuron, but that interneuron essentially is connected to a motor neuron so that the information goes from sensory neuron to interneuron to motor neuron, and then we have the reflex. So that might be the patellar reflex or the one in your heel. There's one at the bottom of your foot, and there's all these things, right? All these reflexes. So essentially what happens is that the reflex is bypassing the trip all the way up the spinal cord to the brain and back out. So it just goes sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, and we have our effect. Okay. Okay, so some parts of the brain, and I'm looking down at my study guide, that you will need to know include these parts. So let's dive into them. Pictures tell us 1,000 words, so you know the big gigantic hemispheres of your brain make up your cerebrum. Let me get my little cursor here. Now I want to skip down to the cerebellum, which looks like a cauliflower type structure that's here just below the occipital lobe of the brain. So you've got your big brain, the cerebrum, and then the cerebellum then is back here. So that's one way to differentiate, is it's like you get your big brain and your little brain. Okay, taking a look at some other parts, the diencephalon is made up of 3 parts. The thalamus, which we'll come back to that, but that's the relay station. The hypothalamus, hypo means below, the hypothalamus essentially is the master control center for your hormones and your endocrine system. And the hypothalamus literally governs the action of the pituitary. So you've got the thalamus, then we have the hypothalamus that looks like kind of this little shark tooth, and then we have the pituitary gland hanging down off of the hypothalamus. So those three parts are contributing to the diencephalon. Then we have the brainstem. So you might have heard people say there's no activity in the brainstem. So here we have the midbrain, which is kind of, it looks like an oblong, maybe a peanut or something like that. And then it descends down. Then we have this sort of expanded area. Looks like maybe a walnut or a coffee bean, and that one is the pons. And then this sort of flattened area just below the pons is the medulla oblongata. So those are all parts you'll want to know, plus the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres together. So you see it here. It almost looks like an embryo, or just kind of like a little comma on its side, or like the shape of an ear right here in the middle of the brain. We will talk more about these parts as we move along. So here we have the cerebrum divided into the right and left hemispheres. And you might be familiar with the fact that it has all of these indentations. So if we take a look at the brain proper, we're going to see that, remember the various bones that make up the skull? We can name them here as well. So the frontal bone also is essentially covering the frontal lobe of the brain. You're not responsible for knowing all these different parts. Essentially, then we go to here. The temporal lobe is covering our, or the temporal bone is covering our temporal lobe. So that's here, okay? And then we have the parietal, which is really back here. And then we have the occipital, which is that lower back lobe here, just above our little brain, the cerebellum, okay? So remember, don't make this any harder than what it is. Frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital. Okay, so, the nervous system is the most complex system in the human body. And it's we're trying to just give you kind of a brief overview of how things work. So let's just keep that there. So the cerebrum is main part of the cerebral cortex. So this is the thin, highly convoluted outer layer of the brain made up of gray matter, and it's covering those cerebral hemispheres, and it's responsible for lots of things: sensation, voluntary movement, thought processes, and consciousness. So we talked about the diencephalon, so the three parts: thalamus, hypothalamus, and pituitary. So let's take a look. I'm going to start down here at the bottom. The thalamus, so that's the relay center of the brain. So essentially it's receiving all the sensory input coming up from that spinal cord, except for the sense of smell. And essentially then it's going to send it to the appropriate part of the cerebrum for interpretation. Just below the hypothalamus, we have what I call the master control center, or the endocrine system. They're referring to it as the integrating center, and essentially it's going to be super responsible for homeostasis. It's going to be monitoring hunger, sleep, thirst, body temperature, water balance, and it's controlling the actual master gland, which is the pituitary gland. And that pituitary gland is going to be releasing a number of hormones to create to help maintain homeostasis. So we'll talk about that more in the endocrine system. So that mini brain in the back, responsible for posture and balance. So that's pretty straightforward there. The brainstem, so you might remember we had a little bean, a coffee bean, and a kind of a flattened structure. So the midbrain, pons, and medulla. And so let's start with the midbrain. So it's acting as a relay station from the cerebrum and the spinal cord or the cerebellum. So that kind of makes sense. It's the highest part of the brainstem, so it's acting as a relay center. It also has reflex centers. So we talked about reflex actions, and the reflex centers there in the midbrain are visual, auditory, and tactile. Then we have the pons. I believe I referred to that as the coffee bean. And it's also going to be doing some communication. So it's communicating between the cerebellum or the little brain and the rest of the central nervous system. Now, the pons with that medulla oblongata is going to be really important to breathing rate. That's why if you have any damage in the brainstem, you could be termed brain dead, and you might need to be on life support. The pons is also going to be important in reflex centers that help coordinate head movements in response to visual and auditory stimuli. All right, medulla. We talked about breathing. It's also regulating heartbeat and blood pressure. And there's some reflex centers: vomiting, coughing, sneezing, hiccuping, and swallowing. And as we know, it's just above the spinal cord. And while it's not that important to us now, but in your future, you might need to know this, that it contains tracts that ascend or descend between the spinal cord and the higher brain centers. I think we're about hit most of the parts of the brain. Let's take a look at one last structure. The brainstem, the highest part, is essentially integrating with the cerebrum, and this is the reticular formation. So we can see that there's a network of nuclei and fibers that extends from the brainstem, and it's going to have a major component in essentially telling the cerebrum that a person is awake and aroused and to be active. But essentially the reticular formation can also weed out unnecessary background noise so that you're essentially able to focus on the things that you need to and drown out things that are not so important. All right, so now we get to identify the reticular formation. So essentially this reticular formation is a bundle of matter, gray matter, I believe, that is now moving, essentially carrying information from part of that medulla and pons and midbrain directly up to the thalamus. So you can see that here. And while we didn't talk about the tracts, they're there as well. Okay, so let's talk about essentially some neurotransmitters. So here are some that are maybe familiar to you. Acetylcholine is essentially known for its more stimulating activity, but also is important for memory circuits. Norepinephrine, dreaming, walking, mood. Dopamine, okay, yes, mood, helps coordinate movements. Serotonin, a lot of emotions involved with serotonin. Sleeping, thermoregulation, and then GABA is actually an inhibitory neurotransmitter. These are going to make sense when we talk about the essentially common mode of action of drugs. Okay, Xanax and Valium. Xanax is used for acute anxiety. Valium is used for panic disorder. And both are going to increase GABA. So GABA is a inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it kind of makes sense that if you're giving someone a medication that's going to increase the activity of GABA, your own natural GABA, that it's essentially going to slow you down and make you calm, okay? Reduced levels of some neurotransmitters are linked to depression, so we often think about serotonin. When you have lower levels of serotonin, it can be linked to depression. That's why doctors prescribe SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So essentially, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are chemicals that are going to prevent the serotonin from being taken back up. So they're hanging out in that synaptic cleft, having more of an activity on the receptors of the dendrites nearby. So essentially, the many antidepressants that are SSRIs work that way. They just mentioned Prozac, but it could also be Zoloft, Lexapro, one of the many kinds. Alzheimer's disease relates to essentially a loss of the ability to retain memories. So medications can be given to Alzheimer's patients that are going to increase acetylcholine and allow it to accumulate in what they call the limbic system, so the emotion centers, to essentially counteract the memory loss. So moving on, schizophrenia, even schizophrenic tendencies of bipolar disorder is related to dopamine, usually too high concentration of dopamine or too much activity of dopamine. So there are medications to decrease the activity of dopamine to help treat schizophrenia. Caffeine there interferes with the effects of inhibitory neurotransmitters of the brain, which that makes sense because we tend to feel much more hyper and energized under the influence of caffeine.